William Ewart Gladstone arrived in Newark at the end of September 1832 to canvass the constituency in advance of the general election of December 1832. He was then a man of young promise. He was 22 years of age. His father was the well-known Liverpool merchant John Gladstone, a Scotsman who had made his name through plantations in the West Indies and through international trade. William Ewart Gladstone was the youngest of his 5 children and the youngest of 4 sons, and John Gladstone had great ambitions for him. Gladstone had gone to Eton College and then on to Christ Church at the University of Oxford, where he had met and befriended Lord Lincoln, the son and heir of the 4th Duke of Newcastle. In this picture of the period, we see Gladstone as an impressive, handsome young man of the period, the rising hope of the stern-unbending Tories, as contemporaries called him. Gladstone's time at Oxford was pivotal in his future political career. The friendship of Lincoln assured him the good favour and attention of Lincoln's father, the 4th Duke of Newcastle. And pictures of Newcastle from the period indicate that he was very much the aristocrat, stern and unbending. Newcastle had a reputation as an ultra-Tory, in other words, as someone that was opposed to all forms of constitutional and political change. In 1832, there had been a Reform Act which was significantly changing the nature of the parliamentary system. However, as maps of Newark of the period indicate, Newcastle was a keen property holder in the constituency, and people did not enjoy the vote in that era by virtue of the fact that they were individual human beings. They enjoyed it by virtue of the fact that they were tenants and property holders. So Newcastle, as the principal property holder in Newark, expected his tenants to vote as he desired. And Punch cartoons from the 1830s and 40s indicate that the Duke took that responsibility seriously and evicted tenants who did not vote for the candidate that he expected them to. So Gladstone's good favour was important in terms of Newcastle's Tory politics. Newcastle expected Gladstone to uphold his principles and ideals, and those were not at this period favourable to reform. Moving on into the second section, what we see is the older Gladstone, the Gladstone that was remembered in biographies, particularly by John Morley. The interesting thing is that biographies of Gladstone tend to skirt over this early Tory period in his life and pay very little attention to the fact that he was the MP for Newark in the 1830s as a Conservative. However, to the people of Newark, Gladstone's connection with the constituency was very important. In 1882, on the 50th anniversary of Gladstone's return to Parliament, the town clerk sent a letter of congratulation, to which Gladstone responded in a letter himself. The following year, great humour was made of the fact that Gladstone sent a plum pudding to the citizens of Newark in remembrance of the original electors, 16 of whom met together to have a celebratory dinner. So Gladstone's part in Newark life was well remembered by Newarkers themselves during the later 19th century. But by that time, Gladstone had himself moved from being a stern Conservative to being a well-known reformist Liberal. And correspondence from the 1870s indicate that Gladstone almost became MP for Newark again during that period as a Liberal. But in fact, that did not turn out to be the case. Gladstone's connection with Newark did continue, however, for many decades into the 1870s and 80s because of his connection with the Newcastle estate, particularly as a trustee of the 5th Duke's will. So there are property deeds and indentures of the period which bear Gladstone's name as a trustee relating to Newark property. Elections in the 19th century were open public events. Even though the vote was not universally given, non-electors expected to be involved in the election campaign. Many illustrations of election scenes survive from the period. So, for example, the volume from the Illustrated London News for the 1850s shows the nature of electioneering at general election time. These were public events, often held in marketplaces or significant public venues. The same was the case at Newark, and illustrated scenes of Newark from 1846 indicate that ceremonies took place centred around the town hall. This was highly important in terms of the way that elections were fought. They were public, and gaining the support of the populace, whether they were electors or not, was important. Interesting survivals from the time that Gladstone was MP for Newark between 1832 and 1846 illustrate some of the colour and nature of electioneering. So, for example, there are calling cards, such as this one from the election of 1841, which Gladstone and Manners, the two Conservative candidates, took round them to electors' homes. And Gladstone recorded on some occasions that these cards were torn up and flung back at his feet, so that the fact that some of them have survived is perhaps remarkable. Elections also generated a large degree of printed literature, so election posters, such as this one from the 1860s, indicated a candidate's platform or the programme on which he was fighting his case. So you see a development in electioneering styles and tactics, but the important thing was that they were public events, and even those that didn't possess the vote intended to have their say and to express their view. This was added to at Newark by the fact that the Duke of Newcastle exercised so much influence. There are colour maps of the period indicating the different areas of electoral influence in the constituency. So the colour red, which was the colour of the Duke's interest, indicated those areas where Newcastle tenants were expected to give Gladstone support. Correspondingly, colours such as yellow and blue indicated opposition candidate support. Gladstone's first election for 1832 was a highly contested affair, and there was an interesting fallout following it. Gladstone's return was perhaps seen as inevitable, given that the Duke's tenants were expected to vote in unison for him. But this was aided by the fact that they were given large quantities of free ale and beer, something which offended the young Gladstone's moral sensibilities. Receipts from the period survive, indicating the way in which electors were given free beer and ale. They would take a ticket to a local inn, in return for which they would get their quart of ale or their tankard of beer, and that would be, as it were, a sweetener for them casting the vote in the intended way. Gladstone did secure his election, but the problem was when the election bills came in, it became apparent just how much free beer and ale had been distributed. Quite worryingly, from Gladstone's point of view, there were resolutions from his election committee indicating their upset at the fact that he did not settle these bills quickly. This was likely to upset the constituents severely because the publicans expected their bills to be settled straight away. And there was a real danger that had they not been settled, largely through the intervention of Gladstone's father and the fourth Duke, who both agreed to supplement the election expenses, then Gladstone himself might not have survived as MP for Newark for more than one term of office. Another interesting survival from the period is the ceremony of chairing the victorious candidate, and illustrations of the time indicate what this involved. What it meant was that Gladstone, as the victorious MP, was paraded around the constituency for everybody to see, whether voter or not, in a chair on top of a platform. And this was indicating the support of the community for Gladstone's return as MP. Nevertheless, Gladstone also recorded that when he got to the rooms of his inn and made his acceptance speech from the window of the Clinton Arms, his greeting was not universally warm, and in fact somebody in the crowd threw a stone at him which narrowly missed his head. The most important person in Gladstone's election and in his relations with the constituency was his agent, William Edward Tallents, whose portrait we see here. Tallents was the land steward of the Duke of Newcastle, but also acted as his political agent, and as such introduced candidates to the constituency. It was an important mechanism between the Duke and Gladstone's election committee, particularly over issues such as the election expenses. However, he was an unpopular figure locally because he had been the person who had served notices on tenants to quit their tenancies if they had not voted as the Duke expected. And we see evidence here of contemporary squibs and poems which attack Tallents directly for that role. Tallents had a son, Godfrey, who was about Gladstone's age and who accompanied him on the canvass around Newark. Godfrey Tallents' diary is shown here. and it illustrates some of the rumbustious nature of Gladstone's first contested election, particularly the fact that there were flag fights. The different contending parties in Newark politics each had their own colour, red, yellow and blue, and each of them paraded flags at election time. But Godfrey Tallant's diary makes it clear that there were actually flag fights during the course of the election, in which the contending parties fought for possession of the flags, a little bit like fighting a military battle and trying to capture the colours of the opposing army. Some of these flags still survive and are currently under consideration for future conservation. They're held by Newark Museum Service. There are also receipts, such as the one noted here, which indicate the ways in which flags could be done up or repaired for future contests. So in 1841, as this receipt indicates, the princely sum of £4 was spent on re-lettering the flag with the notion of conservatism, highly appropriate in terms of Gladstone's political views. Other survivals of Gladstone's first campaign are of a more durable character. The fact that elections were open and all votes cast were recorded publicly meant that there were the production of items such as poll books, indicating how every elector had cast their vote. And this was essential in enforcing electoral control by the Duke and his agents. So poll books such as the one we see here from the 1841 contest are an important source for historians to find out who voted for Gladstone and how electoral influence was exercised in this period. Gladstone continued as MP for Newark until 1846, when a disagreement with the fourth Duke meant that he had to sacrifice the seat. However, if you go to Newark today and go to its marketplace, you will see the remnants of the Clinton Arms, the public house from which Gladstone first addressed the crowds as their victorious MP. And if you look on the wall of the Clinton Arms, you will see a plaque, such as the one illustrated here. And that plaque records the permanent connection between the young W.E. Gladstone and Newark, which was his first parliamentary constituency.
Long life to Chelsea, Newcastle and